Greetings, Internet. Are you at all curious as to how you got here? Now, I'm not talking about your birth or you waking up and doing a YouTube search, but rather how the data got you from doing that YouTube search to you landing on this video. Well, if that's the case, then you wound up in an ideal spot, because today we're going to go over the reference model that highlights those paths, otherwise known as the OSI model. My name is Hayden Lundborg. I'm currently a student at Metropolitan State University studying cybersecurity, and this is my video project for Computer Security 332 Section 50, led by Professor Johannes Tedesse. Let's get into it. The OSI model is a vital tool for understanding how networks communicate and for how information is passed through systems. Broken up into 7 layers, the OSI model conceptualizes those communication paths. If you have not already been made familiar with the OSI model, it's something you should certainly become familiar with if you have any interest in IT. In this video, I'll start with what the OSI model is and its purpose, and then we'll get into some brief history, move on to the main protocols associated with each layer, the security controls to implement at each layer. Additionally, I'll highlight some of the more prevalent threats to look out for that are associated with each layer. After all that, I'll give a brief demonstration as to how data moves throughout each layer, and finally end with the OSI model's importance to computer or cybersecurity as a whole. Quick note, in making this video, I assume no liability for any damages caused by my information or demonstrations presented, as this is solely intended for educational purposes. The Open System Interconnection, aka OSI model, is a logical and conceptual model. It is used to define network communication and general communications between systems. Additionally, it's used to define logical networks and describes packet transfer using the layer of protocols. In essence, the OSI model references the way data gets from point A to point B, breaking down its flow into 7 stages or layers. The OSI model is comprised of 7 layers. Starting from the bottom, it reads physical, data link, network, transport, session, presentation, finally, application. Throughout my other courses, I was told there was a nice mnemonic device for remembering that order, and it has since stuck with me. Please do not throw sausage pizza away. And that's read from the bottom up, and there you have it, 7 layers. It's important to note that this is only used as a reference model and should not be confused with the TCP/IP model. Furthermore, the OSI model can be broken down into 2 categories, the upper layers and the lower layers. The upper layers consist of the session, presentation, and application layers. These are considered more software-based. We'll get into that later. Next, we have the lower layers, which are the physical, data link, and network layers. These layers are considered the hardware layers, which we will also get into later. Sandwiched between the upper and the lower layers is the transport layer, which is considered the root or the heart of this OSI model. This is said because it's responsible for reliable data movement from the network to the session layer, which is a critical step in packet communication. By reliable, I don't mean TCP handshake reliable, but rather ensuring data gets from the hardware to the software in a reliable manner. Before we get too far, I want to get into some quick history. I'll try not to bore you, and I'll keep it brief. In the 1970s, 2 separate projects with the same goal began. That goal was to define a standard for networking systems architecture. Fast forward to 1983, those 2 projects merged, and it was aptly named the Basic Reference Model for Open Systems Interconnect. That proved to be too much to say, so it was condensed to the OSI reference model. Fascinating enough, the OSI model was initially intended to serve as a foundation for a widely adapted protocol suite that would, essentially, become the Internet. However, in 1984, it was formally adopted by the International Organization of Standardization as an international standard, and it remains used merely as a reference model for educational purposes and to describe data flow. If you're interested in reading more, or if you're curious as to how it almost became the internet as we know it today, you can do a quick Google search for OSI model history. Starting from the bottom, we have the physical layer, which aids in defining the electrical and physical specifications of the data connection. Essentially, this physical layer gives us the relationship between a device and a physical transmission medium, for example, cables. Physical layer is easy to remember. Just think of cables and think of things that you can physically touch. This layer is also not associated with any high-level protocols, rather based on physical specifications such as 100 base TX, ISDN, etc. Some of the hardware you can associate in the physical layer are Ethernet cables, fiber optic, repeaters, hubs, so forth. Main functions here include transmission of bits and meeting providing electrical specifications. Potential attacks that to be mindful of in this layer are mainly denial of service attacks via cut wires, physical damage to network rooms, communication closets, so forth. Security controls that'll aid in limiting those attacks are mainly enacted via physical security controls. For example, locking doors to network rooms and only allowing access to those that need to be in there. Running cables away from open areas, hide them behind walls, up in ceilings, and or security guards and man traps. Moving on to layer 2, we have the data link layer, which can be subdivided into 2 layers. First, we have the media access control layer, the MAC, which controls how devices in a network gain access to the specified medium and permits to transmit data. The second sublayer is the logical link layer, which encapsulates network layer protocols and allows for error detection. As a whole, the data link layer manages data that is exchanged across the same physical network. This is before it gets transmitted out. The data link layer organizes bits into frames and provides hop-to-hop delivery. A few important protocols here are PPP, point-to-point protocol, which adds framing bytes to IP packets, LAP, or link access procedure, which is responsible for framing and transferring data across point-to-point links, and LCP, link control protocol, which is like PPP protocol that establishes, configures, tests, terminates links for transmission of data frames. Some attacks to be mindful of in this layer are MAC flooding, which involves sending a plethora of packets with fake MAC addresses to overflow the switch table, making it unable to process legitimate traffic, and ARP poisoning, where attackers trick a device into sending messages to the hacker instead of the recipient. A security control to aid in preventing MAC flooding is to enable port security, while for ARP poisoning, you can enable packet filtering firewalls, which will flag data packets that are found twice or spoofed in the network. Most importantly, encryption is your strongest form of defense in this layer. Capping off the lower level layers, we have the network layer, which is precisely where most routing functions occur by exchanging data between servers. In essence, the network layer routes data to different networks, from source to destination. Message delivery here is not guaranteed, however. Some protocols to be familiar with in the network layer are ICMP, Internet Control Message Protocol, which is used for reporting errors and performing network diagnostics, TCP, otherwise known as IPv4, IPv6, UDP, TCP's unreliable little brother, and FTP, File Transfer Protocol. Attacks to be mindful here are denial of service attacks, ping floods, and ICMP attacks. To prevent against any of these, a recommended security control to block pings with your perimeter firewall or disable ICMP functionality at the targeted router. Other DOS attacks have similar recommended security controls. Now, for the heart of the model, the transport layer. This layer coordinates the transfer of data between systems and hosts, defining data rates, destinations, and more. This layer builds upon the network layer but ensures data is delivered error-free and in sequence. You can control the reliability via flow control, error control, segmentation, which also provides acknowledgement of successful data transmissions. The most important protocol to be familiar with in this layer is TCP, which uses that three-way handshake to guarantee reliable delivery. Attacks to be mindful of in layer 4 are port scanning and SYN flood attacks. A SYN flood attack is a type of denial of service that exploits the TCP protocol three-way handshake by just sending a barrage of SYN packets at it, denying or disrupting its service. Port scanning is simply when attackers scan to find open ports, which are weak points in a network that can be exploited. Remediate these potential attacks by implementing strong firewalls. Additionally, you can perform your own vulnerability port scan, or your own port scan to identify those vulnerabilities, closing off any unneeded ports before your attackers get there. Moving on to the high-level layers, at layer 5 we have the session layer. Session layer is aptly named because here we have two devices, A and B, and they have established a session. The session layer is responsible for setting up that session, coordinating responses, and termination. Additionally, this layer handles logon and password validations. Two protocols associated with this layer are RCP, Remote Call Procedure Protocol, and NetBIOS. RCP is a software communication protocol that aids in communication between two clients as it authenticates client requests, connecting A to B. NetBIOS, on the other hand, enables applications on different devices to communicate with each other across a LAN. As we get into the higher level layers, attacks become more related to flaws in code, as these layers are more software based, because now the data has gotten outside to its destination. Some examples are session hijacking, man-in-the-middle attacks, where attackers sniff traffic to uncover sought-after data. To help prevent these types of attacks, recommended security controls are to enable strong encryption, as always, use of VPNs, strong passwords, and authentication methods. In the presentation layer, otherwise known as the syntax layer, we start to see data become translated from its network form to its application form. Put simply, data is presented to the application so that it can be formatted and understood by the next applicable layer, which is the application layer. Additionally, we start to see encryption and decryption take place in character code translation, ASCII, and so forth. Key protocols in this layer include SSL, TLS, JPEG, and more. SSL is secure socket layer and is responsible for encrypting data between websites and browsers between two servers. TLS, or transport layer security, is similar, except it's considered the upgraded version of SSL as it's more secure. Attacks to be mindful of in the presentation layer include sniffing and phishing. Phishing is when false messages manipulate users into giving attackers information that they probably shouldn't be given. Usually, attackers are after credit cards or other PII. Methods could include fake emails, websites, and pop-ups. The easiest method to prevent against phishing is education via security awareness training. If it doesn't look or feel right, don't click it. Strong passwords and MFA are another control of mitigation. Rounding out the last of them with layer 7, we have the application layer. This is the layer that directly interacts with the user. This could be web browsers, Zoom, email clients, etc. The application layer interacts with software applications. This is the layer end users are most familiar with, aside from the physical layer with things you can touch. Here, we have some protocols that should look fairly familiar, most of which revolve around email, such as SMTP, FTP, SNMP, and then there's HTTP for web browsing. These are all the protocols that are mainly used to communicate. Some attacks we start to see in this layer are mainly DOS attacks, with distributed denial of service attacks occurring as well against web servers. And cross-site scripting attacks. Cross-site scripting happens when an attacker attaches code onto a legitimate website and executes when a user loads that website. A key control to mitigate against that is to validate input on the coding end. Whereas with HTTP DOS attacks, a mitigation control to implement is intrusion detection systems and firewalls. To better explain and to give you a visual of what is happening throughout this process, in each layer, I'm going to give you a quick demo of a real-world application, one most of us use every day. That's sending an email. This demo is going to reference the core activities at each layer. So, starting in the application layer, the information you type into your application is Gmail, Outlook, Apple Mail, or Hotmail, if that even still exists, is sent to the relevant software to its relevant communication stack. The protocol used for this process is going to be Simple Mail Transfer Protocol, or SMTP. Then, in the presentation layer, once it's received from the application layer, data is then formatted in a way that the receiving end can view and understand. ASCII is the common one you're going to see for formatting here. Additionally, encryption takes place if necessary, and if we're dealing with email, that's a likely scenario. Moving on to the session layer, communication channels are simply opened between the sending and receiving server to establish a connection. Now, for the heart of it all in the transport layer, we're going to see the data get segmented into smaller bytes, making for more efficient transmissions. Additionally, things like whether you use TCP or UDP get sorted out, and source and destination ports are added for reliable delivery. In the case of email, TCP will be used for guaranteed delivery using the three-way handshake, and port 25 for SMTP will be added. Now, in layer 3, network layer, segmented data from the transport layer is further broken down into packets that contain routing information, meaning the IP address for the mail server is added for the source and destination servers, getting ready to route it out. After leaving the network layer and hitting the data link layer, packets are further encapsulated into frames for transmission by adding the necessary MAC addresses. Error detection will occur here as well. Finally, in layer 1, data is sent out over the Ethernet to the receiving end. Frames are converted to binary, suited to the specified standards of the medium it's transmitting on. Now, once it hits the receiving end, the data will go through the layers in the opposite order. So instead of layer 7 to 1, it's going to go 1 to 7. As the data is reconstructed and prepares to be presented, it goes as follows. Starting with the physical layer, binary signals are converted back into frames. In the data link layer, frames are then reassembled into packets. Now, in the network layer, packets are then combined to form segmented data. Segmented data is assembled to its complete form in the transport layer. The session layer will terminate the session that was already open. The presentation layer will format it again, possibly decrypt, in our case, probably. Then, the data is delivered to the application software for you to read, and it's done. There you have it, a real-world example of referencing data as it relates to an email. I hope this helps you to visualize a little better. Now we'll get back to the presentation, talk about its relevance to computer security, and begin our wrap-up. So, now you may be thinking, well, that's neat. I can reference my data going from the wire to the application, but what does that have to do with computer security? Well, simply put, when there is an action being performed, such as data flowing from point A to point B, there is a possibility for abnormality. Being able to identify the abnormality, determine if it's malicious, and then placing it in the correct layer will aid tremendously in troubleshooting and resolution as a techno expert and save so much time. For example, we just learned that denial of service attacks can happen in most, if not all, layers. If it's a physical wire that got cut in layer 1 and it causes the denial of service, that involves a much different remediation tactic compared to a layer 7 denial of service attack. Being able to quickly identify sources of exploits will save you or your company time, money, and resources, and importantly, headaches. Furthermore, knowing what security controls to implement at the intended layer aids in hardening your assets, providing better overall security and protection. To recap in a nutshell, the OSI model contains 7 layers, with the lower 3 being the physical, data link, and network layers, which are more so dedicated to the hardware aspects of data communication. The middle layer, transport, being the heart of data transmission, and the top 3 higher level layers, which are session, presentation, and application, and they're all software related. The OSI model was developed to help us understand communication throughout networks. It aids in troubleshooting because functions are separated and broken down into layers, which also helps technical security experts to segregate and categorize security controls properly. Furthermore, it allows us to compare functional relationships on different layers. The OSI model is as vital to security as it is to overall flow control of data, as it aids in troubleshooting and remediation if and when exploits occur. I hope you learned something new or fun in my presentation. Now, get to know it and start using it.